Okay, it's 4:02. I think we should probably kick this off. We want to be respectful of people's time. Thank you all who have joined us for this webinar today. We're grateful that you could attend and be with us, and we're happy to be with you. We're talking today about helping businesses navigate and neutralize financial distress arising from the COVID-19 pandemic and the related government countermeasures. It's a big topic, and we're covering a lot of ground, and it's complex, and we have limited time. So it's going to be an overview. Really. We'll talk at a high level. Certainly, there are some specific situations we will discuss, but the discussion today is really going to be an overview of the COVID-related distress type issues that we and our clients are encountering, and some of the strategies that can be employed to manage and hopefully neutralize some of that distress. We're talking mainly from a commercial contracting and a finance perspective today. That is, we're not going to discuss, for example, labor and employment, which is a big part of this as well. I'm joined today by Mark Kushwa, who is the head of our real estate practice, Gus Kalergis, the co-head of our bankruptcy and restructuring practice, and Sager, my partner in the commercial finance group, and I'm Carl Buse, and I'm the head of our combined commercial and public finance group. So I guess with that introduction, really, the COVID-19 epidemic and the impacts on business, I think, are fairly well chronicled. I don't think we need to spend an awful lot of time talking about what they are, but I will ask Gus, really, just as an insolvency and distressed lawyer, really, what are you seeing out there in companies and dealing with their own distress, I guess, to start? How is that manifesting itself? And just give us a few comments on that, but to kick it off, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I'm happy to. And I guess the one thing I would start, and I think, Carl, you said this in your intro, I mean, the primary focus of this panel is to address the distress that is a direct result of the current pandemic. Obviously, there were plenty of companies that were in distress prior to the pandemic that have their own individual problems that require specific solutions for them. But right now, we're really kind of talking about that situation where you previously had a healthy business in a relatively strong economy that is now experiencing some kind of business, disruption. The government ordered shutdown of non-essential businesses, the impact of social distancing measures, and what the new business normal is. And I kind of look back at this, back to 2008, 2009, when we had the Great Recession, and the questions that I was addressing at the time as a restructuring insolvency lawyer were, well, how do you restructure a business that loses 30 or 40% of its customer base, without any real fault of its own? And that's analogous to what's happening now, right? You have out of nowhere, businesses that were healthy, suddenly they have no customers. Or what happens under the current norms when you can't operate efficiently? I think what you're seeing is, for a company's own distress, I mean, they're feeling pressure on both sides because of how interconnected the economy is in businesses. Their customers are in distress, so they're slowing down payments to them. Their vendors are in distress and potentially having a shutdown. And so you have all this supply chain interruption that's occurring, that's impacting just their operations, their ability to get product out the door and get cash in the door. And so when you have that, I think what we're seeing is, it's systemic in many industries. You think about, all those industries that have now had their kind of world turned upside down for all intents and purposes, no fault of their own or no fault in the way that they were operating, whether it's hospitality and travel. I'm representing a hotel franchisor in a bankruptcy of one of its franchisees, and they're down to, their occupancy rate is somewhere between 6 and 15%. How do you operate a hotel in those circumstances? Think about retail. And and they were getting hammered before, but obviously J.C. Penney's filed, J. Crew has filed, and it's bringing to light problems that are in this industry generally, but that are only accentuated and accelerated in part because suddenly you just don't have the foot traffic, and you have discretionary spending doesn't exist. There's I was reading earlier today that commercial transportation has dropped somewhere between 20 and 40%. And so what you see, again, think about live music, sporting events, all those things. This is touching everybody on every side. And so when you have this global supply chain disruption, you have different infection periods, various times and strategies for how the economy is going to reopen. You can see that companies are going to try to address their individual issues as they pop up, and it's not surprising that you may turn around and say, okay, I'm not going to be able to perform under my supply agreement. I'm not going to be able to sell that product, produce that product, and sell it. I may not be able to pay for product that I purchased in time. I may not be able to provide those services. So the places that we're seeing the distress that I think you normally begin to see it again are the supply agreements, senior service agreements. You hear, and Mara's going to address this even more extensively, of tenants who are deciding, commercial retail tenants or other tenants who are deciding not to pay their landlords. And so, there are impacts in the commercial lease agreements. And then similarly, I think this is coming across in your bank documents and other lending arrangements where you have an interest payment or other kind of loan payment. Where because you don't have the cash coming in, you're trying to decide where cash is going. And so, again, I think what we're going to talk about here for the most part, at least in the beginning, is kind of the isolated impact of these individual breaches and dealing with a particular contract. Now, it's clear that at some point these could aggregate and suddenly you don't have a isolated situation that you're trying to address, or the potential implications of that isolated distress. But maybe you're approaching insolvency and something that requires a more comprehensive approach, whether it's bankruptcy or other types of process. And we'll talk a little bit about that towards the end. But again, I think we're looking at those individual commercial relationships right now, and we want to focus on the impact and strategies for addressing those individual breaches.
Thanks, Gus. Yeah, I'm reminded of I was an English major in a former life, and I'm reminded of a quote from Hemingway's novel, The Sun Also Rises. One character asks another how he got in financial distress, and he says something to the effect of, for a long time, very gradually, and then very suddenly. And that's normally how financial stress happens, I think, in most companies that I work with, but that's not what happened here. Here, it's all been very sudden, and it's systemic, as you say. I think that's one of the big differences, really. And so we're going to try and highlight those differences. So we are going to talk about, for example, a situation. Let's start with a situation where you're as a company, you're not going to be able to pay someone. You're not going to be able to perform under an agreement that you have. So what do you do with that? Well, in normal circumstances, of course, you're going to look at that normal non-COVID circumstances. You would look at that and say, okay, well, one, you've got Gus's issue, which is the overall, why is that happening? But let's focus on the smaller issue for the moment, and that is, what can I do about it under this contract? And so you're going to examine your rights under that contract. You're going to talk to the counterparty, or you're going to examine the counterparty's rights and try and figure out how they might react. You're probably going to have some conversations with them. You might try and work out a bilateral solution. All fair and good. Now, you might do similar things in a COVID context as well, but there are other things that have come into play. For example, because of the systemic nature of it, you might actually, even if you have a breach under one contract, if it's a big enough breach, or if you have a potential breach under 8 or 10 contracts that becomes a big issue altogether, then you might actually be bringing in some other contracts into play that you might not have thought about. We call that, it could be a cross default situation, or it could just be a breach of a representation or warranty. under another agreement. A lot of times we see these in your debt agreements or your commercial lease agreement. And I guess, Mara, do you want to talk a little bit about that in the lease context?
Sure, Carl, thanks. Drilling down to the specifics in the context of a default or non-performance under a commercial lease, we have to look at three essential questions. What are the operative documents? Who are the necessary parties? And what did the terms of the operative documents require? So identifying the operative documents really helps us frame the question of whether we are dealing with a default under a single lease agreement or a single contract, or whether we're dealing with that lease or contract executed in the context of a larger transaction. For example, you might have executed the lease in connection with a transaction wherein there are guarantees, there are subordination non-disturbance agreements, there may be other loan documents, and there may be a sublease involved. In that case, you're going to, that understanding those operative documents is going to help us understand who are the necessary parties to the resolution, to the solution, to the discussion. So if you're considering a default situation where you're going to have a cross default, you have to consider the context of the default under that lease causing a default under your guarantee documents. And so tenant has obligations to its guarantors. If there was a subordination non-disturbance agreement or other loan documents, the tenant not only has obligations to its landlord, but the tenant has obligations, as does the landlord, have direct obligations to the lenders. If there's a sublease, then the tenant may have obligations to landlord, its lenders, its own guarantors, and the subtenant. So knowing what the operative documents are and who the necessary parties are essential to understanding how we get to a resolution. And then you have to drill down to the very specific terms of the operative documents. For example, the governing law in the context of commercial leases is that the lease agreement is the specific and negotiated agreement of sophisticated parties, and it's typically going to be enforced in accordance with its terms. So then we need to look to the lease document itself and what are the events of default, what are the remedies, and what do they require. It may be, you're certainly going to have that non-payment of rent is going to be a default, but you should also look and pay attention to the fact that admission of insolvency or the institution of bankruptcy proceedings may also be a default, not only under the lease, but of the collateral and related financing agreements.
Thanks, Mara. Yeah, so in addition to the defaults that you may have under your lease agreement arising from well, I guess that's the point, is you may have other defaults arising under your lease agreement from things that are happening in your business that you might not have thought about because they aren't really right top of mind usually. Anne, do you want to talk about that in the financing context?
Yeah, so on the same vein, I mean, if you're unable to pay under one of your contracts, maybe you're considering stretching the payment terms, or you just think from a business standpoint, you don't want to make a payment under a certain contract. You need to carefully look under your credit facility. If that's considered a material contract, you might end up with a cross default. Oftentimes, credit facilities have a threshold amount related to the consideration there of the contract. So you need to be careful that you're not creating a cross default under your own credit facility because you didn't pay another contract. Also, oftentimes leases are identified as material contracts depending on what the circumstances are. So making sure that, again, that doesn't trigger a default under your credit facility because you decided perhaps you don't want to pay under another contract. The other thing you need to look at is oftentimes credit facilities have covenants related to payment and performance under material contracts or leases, depending on, a lot of times if it's a asset-based facility, there's additional requirements to perform under various leases, depending on where your collateral is located. And then you also need to look at your reps and warranties. Number one, is this not performing under this contract? Is it material enough that you are unable to make some of your own representations and warranties under your credit facility? Would this have a material adverse effect? You need to look at that. And then finally, oftentimes credit facilities require notices of certain, if you receive a notice under a material contract, whether that's a notice of default or perhaps the counterparty is willing to work with you, but that's some other type of notice. Oftentimes you need to provide those notices to your lender. So being careful about what you're doing and how it interplays with your financing arrangements.
Interesting. So what are you guys seeing out there among landlords, for example, and lenders in terms of how they're dealing with these defaults? Or is there a recognition that, that this is based on something bigger than just an issue with the business, or is there a leniency that we're seeing?
So, what we're seeing is sort of twofold. In Ohio, there are a couple of government encouraged presumptions in favor of small businesses. So the House Bill 197 and the Supreme Court's action on the same date of March 27th created like this very strong presumption that the government was encouraging delay in prosecution of evictions and protecting small businesses. And on April 1st, the governor of the state of Ohio requested landlords consider suspension of collection of rents for 90 days and that lenders consider suspension of foreclosure actions for 90 days. So there's this government enhanced or government encouraged presumption in favor of some leniency and consideration to small businesses. But I also see very specific actions being taken between landlords and tenants. The specific actions could include things like rent abatement, respread of rents. So to the extent that rent abatement is granted, you might permanently abate part of the rent, but then respread the rest of that portion of that over the life of the lease. We've seen terms extended where the landlord is making itself whole by collecting rent over a longer term. We're seeing basically reformulations of rents. So you might decrease base rent and add a percentage rent so that you're giving consideration to the tenant currently, but you're going to gain from the upside when the business rebounds, presuming that you can predict that with some degree of certainty. And then we're also seeing on the flip side, we're seeing landlords require greater security deposits and additional guarantees. So, landlords are needing to consider and really should consider the long view in discussing remedies in this COVID situation with their tenants, because you need to understand the specific tenant and its financial wherewithal. But you also need to understand the industry in the long view and whether any potential desirable tenant even exists. So it may make great business sense to work with the bird in hand, the tenant that you have, because there may not be a perfect alternative.
And I think on the financing side, the lenders are obviously aware that, companies are having issues from a liquidity standpoint. I think everybody is, at this point, I would assume, given we're a couple months into this, I know that lenders are in close communication with their borrowers and really trying to help borrowers figure out, navigate this and neutralize the effects as much as possible. I think it's something that if you think you're not going to make a payment under some other agreement that may be material, I definitely would encourage you to reach out to your lender and speak with them. If you can't make a payment under your own credit facility, which I know Gus mentioned a little bit, we are seeing lenders give waivers for P&I payments. I think similar to what Mara said, maybe that, under a lease that you might have an increased security deposit. I think that you might, as we'll talk about a little bit later, but there, you might be trading something for that. So I know some of the private credit lenders, for example, have been capitalizing interest payments that are not being made. So, that's being added back to the principal, but you don't need to make it right now because it really is a liquidity issue as opposed to, a long-term problem. So, I mean, I think the lenders are working with everyone, and, you know, I would just encourage closely talking with your lender if you think that you're going to be unable to make a payment under some other contract that may implicate your financing.
Yeah, and
Sure.
I would echo that we're encouraging clients to speak early and often, you know, landlords to tenants, because the necessity is now and current, but there's a long-term view that can be very advantageous to all the parties. But in order to do that, you have to be really, really prepared for the conversation. Know the terms of your documents, know your financial condition and what you're able to offer in the short term and in the long term, and then be willing to be flexible and consider some alternatives. And then lastly, but very importantly, make sure that you document all concessions and all agreements that are reached in modification of existing agreements.
Great advice, Mara. Yeah, I would say the same thing in the commercial contracting context. Good communication is key. Also, careful communication is key. In the commercial contracting context, for example, if you're dealing with a sale of goods, you have to be really careful about how you're communicating when you're in the vicinity of your own breach, because some ways that you can communicate that. And by the way, if you're in breach, that's one thing. But if you're right and sort of near it, and it's not clear that you're in breach or that you're into breach yet, that's when you have to be really careful, because you could, without intending to, be communicating that you are intending to breach the contract, and that you are effectively anticipatorily repudiating the contract, which gives rights to your counterparty. And so you just want to be really careful about how you're communicating and get some legal advice around that. Gus, did you want to talk a little bit more about commercial contracting and strategies for dealing with COVID-related breaches?
Well, I guess the one thing I would say is when you're dealing with your commercial contracts or any of your contracts or your relationships, yeah, you have to understand kind of what the power relationship is. And this is a business. With all of these things, it's always a mixed question of a business issue and a legal issue, because you may have legal options, but they may not be good options, or there may be things that you want to avoid. And so, again, having a strategy for dealing with your commercial contracts is important. And again, there could be a difference here between, what you legally have the ability to do and whether or not you really want to do that, right? And so identifying, relationships that are important to you, the areas, where you're likely to have some leverage with your customer because they really need you, or and maybe they can provide some support because they need the product you're producing, or again, even with one of the things that Ann said, and I think transparency with your lender is generally very important, but also kind of recognizing, I think that I was listening to a workout banker panel last week, and the one thing that I heard that makes sense to me is, I think workout bankers and lenders are bucketing, are looking at their borrowers and trying to identify, look, is this really a COVID related issue, or is this were you already in trouble, and so that you're already a problem credit. And I think the tendency to give a little bit more leeway to those who are generally were healthy before, versus those who were already struggling, I think that continues to exist. And again, I think it's identifying those individual relationships, but then also recognizing when potentially you've got a bigger problem, where you need to treat your creditors in a collective manner. And again, that's a case-by-case, industry-by-industry basis, depending on what you need to do and what you hope to accomplish. And for those situations, I think if people are approaching that, and whether you're you think that you're about to become insolvent, you're not going to be able to pay your debts as they become due, generally, not just in the short term. I think it's really important at that time to start thinking strategically and maybe contingency plan a little bit more, and we can talk about that a little bit more later.
Thanks, Gus. Yeah, so those are some good thoughts around seeking a bilateral or possibly, as Gus alluded to just a moment ago, a multilateral solution with your counterparty or counterparties. Now, one of the interesting things about the COVID-19 situation and the distress is that I hear the word force majeure more in the past 3 months than I have in my entire career before that. So there's a lot of noise around force majeure and doctrines of impossibility or impracticability or frustration of purpose. So I guess, are you guys seeing those? Mara, are you seeing that in the commercial lease context? And how does it play out in the COVID-19 context?
Yeah, we see it frequently. So the doctrine of force majeure or superior force is a concept born out of contract law. And you commonly see force majeure provisions in commercial leases, property purchase agreements, construction contracts, and the like. Force majeure typically defines events beyond the party's reasonable control, which may provide permissible temporary delays in performance under the contract documents. But importantly, force majeure is not it does not entirely excuse performance. So parties need to be beware of that. And the more sophisticated the lease or the contract, the more detailed the force majeure provisions will be. So even if an event of force majeure type provision is included in your contract, it may excuse some, but not all performance obligations. And frequently, it does not excuse the non-payment of rent. So in many commercial leases and other commercial contracts, the payment of rent is absolute. Carl, do you see force majeure in other commercial contracts?
Sure, it's in a lot of commercial contracts. It's generally not in financing agreements for the reason that you mentioned, that the payment, the obligation to pay money is not viewed by your lender as something that is negotiable depending on whether there's been a superior force. That money is owed and is to be repaid. So the provisions for the most part don't even exist in credit documents. Now in commercial contracts, and it does exist. And I think there's general agreement that in fact a global pandemic and the government countermeasures that shut down business, to the extent that you can tie those, to the extent that you can create a causal connection between those and the distress you're having in your business, that would typically meet the definition of force majeure in most contracts. It's not always that easy to create a causal connection though. So, and as Mara said, it's dependent wholly on the language of the contract. And so you need to look at the contract and decide what it says. Now, that being said, we are seeing a lot more cases now, as I mentioned, of people asserting force majeure. But in my experience, they're not, nobody's yet, anyway, nobody's litigating the issue or insisting on the issue. I'm seeing it more as part of the conversation, really. We think we're obviously dealing with all sorts of COVID-related stress, and by the way, we think this meets the definition of force majeure, so we think our obligation should be excused for the period of the force majeure. And then the counterparty reacts to that, and it becomes a negotiation. Gus, do you see anything different than that? Or?
No, I think that's right. I mean, I think in all of these things, and that's one of the things I alluded to before, is that just because you have a legal right doesn't mean that you want to exercise it or you want to do. Oftentimes, the goal of a lot of this is to get people to the table to talk, because everybody's experiencing this. And like I said, just like you're sitting there potentially with a desire to stress out your payables, your customer is doing the same thing to you and their customer. And it's a chain that just keeps going up and down to everyone. And so finding a way to address those, situations in a manner that makes sense is, it's kind of that's the goal. And maybe Carl, it's worthwhile just talking at least right now as to picking and choosing who you're going to pay. I mean, that's again one of those things. When you're sitting here and you're looking at all the different obligations that you have, how do you decide who to pay? I mean, obviously the law has, different priorities, and you have to work with your secured lender because oftentimes they have a lien on all your assets, right? But just because everybody is most of your vendors, will say, are unsecured creditors, doesn't mean that they're all equally important to you, even though they're equal under the law and they should be paid with the same priority. When you're trying to survive and buy yourself time to see how all of this is going to shake out, that's not the you need to prioritize those vendors that are most important to you, those vendors that you can't replace. I think in this time, having talked to some folks in the business, there's a tendency to want to pay everybody a little bit. And that may not be the right call in this particular situation, where the people that are very important and supply product to you need to survive, and they need your payment. And so, kind of prioritizing that, figuring out which customers are the most profitable to you and need you. Those, I think, are the ways to address those particular issues. And then similarly, I would say, was raised up by earlier by one of the panelists as well, is you should also think about whether or not paying certain vendors avoids personal liability. And so there are certain claims that if your company does not pay, potentially leads to personal liability for officers and directors. An example would be trust fund taxes, sales and use taxes, employee withholdings, all of those things. If you fail to pay, they generally lead to director liability. And so again, my general counsel, at least when I'm talking to a company that's in distress and dealing with some of these greater issues, you got to make sure you pay those things. You want to make sure you don't bring your employees in if you're not going to be able to pay them. And so you really have to pick and choose, at least for a time now, to preserve that cash so that you have options later.
Thanks, Gus. Yeah. Just to go back and touch real briefly on impracticability and impossibility. Those are legal doctrines. We're not going to spend a lot of time on them, but they're basically legal doctrines that apply in case that could potentially apply if you didn't have a force majeure provision in your contract, and provide potentially similar rights. But again, like force majeure, they're very limited. Impossibility in particular is and that's the one that is most prevalent in most jurisdictions. Impracticability is a looser standard, but it really doesn't exist in Ohio at all. The doctrine of impossibility would say that if the performance of the contract has become completely impossible, for example, because the government has shut down your facility, then you can be excused during the period of impossibility. But it can't be used like a force majeure. It can't be used just to deal with reduced demand. And like force majeure, it almost never is used to avoid the payment of avoid the obligation to pay money. Let's jump real quickly and just talk about, because we've hit around this a few times, about dealing with our own counterparties' distress. So, which is something that is again kind of unique about this COVID-19 time. We're all dealing with our own distress, and then we have to deal with most of our counterparties, our suppliers, our customers. Many or most of them in many businesses are all in distress as well. And I guess it's a little bit of a mirror image of the discussion we just had, so I don't want to belabor the points. But I guess, Gus, what are you seeing that's different in commercial contracting in terms of dealing with a counterparty as opposed to dealing with a counterparty stress as opposed to dealing with your own?
Well, again, this is one of those blended, business decisions and legal issues that you have to address. And so, again, depending on what side of the business it is, again, I think one of the things that's different is, when everybody's experiencing this distress, you may not be, you have to understand the power relationship, and you may not be as quick to exercise your rights and remedies. So, for example, I have a client who is a supplier of food products, and they received a letter that was sent out by one of their customers to all their vendors that unilaterally sought to extend terms to 75 days. Now, our particular client, their days were net 15, and they turned around and said, you know, they were in a position of power. They knew that this product was needed, and they didn't want to set a precedent for other customers of theirs. And so the response was, you can't unilaterally change these payment terms, notwithstanding this pandemic, and that we treated this as an anticipatory breach and demanded immediate payment, and basically said, we're not going to ship any further product until we have adequate assurance that you're going to be able to pay us on a go-forward basis. And it resulted in that vendor, or excuse me, that customer turning around and paying us right away. Now, on the other side, if you have a customer, if you have a vendor that's supplying product to you, and you're doing a little bit better than they are, or that you have more availability or the ability to weather this storm, this is one of those situations where you may turn around, and this was common back when the auto industry was in distress, and probably will come back around again, where you had customer financing arrangements or different ways that a customer would support its vendors, either by quick paying their own invoices to give much needed cash to their vendors, or potentially financing them. Sometimes we've had, I've represented clients, again, where they're trying to keep their vendor afloat, where they buy raw material directly for the benefit of that vendor, and then offset that against what they need to owe, just to, again, to try to keep people alive during this period. So, I mean, that's kind of what I'm generally saying. It might make sense really quickly to put in a quick word about preferences here as to, how quickly do you want to demand payment from your customers. And, preferences, I think it's something that people tend to be overly concerned with because obviously any payment that you receive on an antecedent debt within 90 days of a company filing bankruptcy is potentially recoverable as a preference. And so there's always a risk when you're trying to collect on an open debt that potentially accelerates payment or deviates from some of your other terms, that there's a preference risk. And the best way to avoid that is obviously getting paid in advance or getting paid contemporaneously. But ultimately, my general advice is not to worry about those things. It's to get, if you can't get that, get as much money as you can, as fast as you can, because you just don't know when that company will ever file, and if there will ever be a preference period to actually worry about. And so I think all of those things, kind of understanding the different pressures and positions for everyone, kind of dictate how you respond to your counterparty's distress.
Thanks, Gus. Mara, in the commercial lease context, if you're a landlord, for example, dealing with tenant stress, what are you thinking about right now?
Well, there's the communication piece, which is key in that, I'm repeating myself probably, but to the extent that you are having a dialogue and you're willing to give concessions to your tenants, document them, document the purposes for the concession, and preserve your rights. So look to your lease agreement. If their non-performance excuses your performance, you're going to want to make note of that. You're going to want to reserve your economic penalties that you can enforce against a tenant should they not come back online and not agree to an alternative arrangement. Those remedies include, penalties, interest, clawing back incentives granted at the outset of the term, forfeiture of the security deposit, and then there's also the property remedies. You always have the right to pursue eviction, and you might want to reserve that right. You have the right to terminate the lease, and you have the right to forcible entry and detainer in certain circumstances.
Thanks, Mara. So I guess really, to summarize, really, it's kind of similar things to dealing with your own stress, seeking bilateral or multilateral solutions where they make sense, doing it all in the service of a broader strategy, really, and understanding that nearly everybody you're dealing with on all sides of all issues really has potential for financial distress going on. With that, I'm gonna move on. And by the way, I don't think I said, okay, I can't remember whether I said this at the beginning or not. There's a tab on your screen for questions, and feel free to type them in, and we'll try and answer those as we go. Otherwise, we'll try and reserve a little bit of time at the end as well. If you might have to hover to see it. We're going to move to another topic now, dealing with liquidity. Move the slide to do that. I guess, Ann, you're the financing expert here. Why don't you talk to us a little bit about liquidity in the market and what people are doing to make sure they've got access to cash right now?
Sure. So I think first we would, we have to mention, obviously there's a broad range of stimulus programs available right now. I would assume everyone on this call has heard about the Paycheck Protection Loans. There's also emergency SBA loans. There's Main Street Lending Program that's still being rolled out. State-specific loans. There's even, I think we've touched on some of our companies that have international presences. Each country is doing their own stimulus. So something to definitely look into if you're facing liquidity issues. That's available to you. The second piece, though, is of course if you have a revolving credit facility, looking at what liquidity do you have under your revolver. So two things there. Thinking about cash versus your borrowing availability. So if you have cash, great. You're likely perhaps in the minority right now, but as we continue to stretch into the shelter in place and everything else across the country. But the other thing to look at is what are you able to borrow under your facility? So in the sense of looking at, is there even do you have enough room under your revolver, looking at what loans are outstanding, looking at what letters of credit are outstanding to meet your liquidity needs. If the answer to that is no, we would of course say talk with your lenders. Again, lenders are working with people and monitoring liquidity very closely. I think that brings us into another point is committed versus uncommitted. I know, Carl, you and I have spoken a little bit about this, and I think being careful that your revolving line is a fully committed line so that if you meet the conditions under your revolver that you can actually draw on that versus an uncommitted line, which gives the lender discretion, in which case, again, you need to be speaking with your lender very closely there, but kind of making sure that your document works the way that you think it does and that that line of credit is actually there for you as opposed to being a discretionary consideration. Anything, I guess, I feel like I jumped in on, normally, Carl, you would talk about that, but.
No problem, yeah.
I know we're running out of time, so we're trying to be a little quick here. So the next thing you want to think about is whether or not you actually can borrow under your revolver. So not just whether or not you have the availability, but can you bring down your reps and warranties? So anytime you're making seeking a borrowing under your facility, you need to bring down your reps and your warranties. And then also there needs to be no default or event of default in 90% of instances. Some facilities, I think it's just event of default, but typically speaking, you have both defaults and no event of default. So making sure kind of all of the things we talked about leading up to this, are there other things that are going on in your liquidity situation? Customers aren't paying you, or you're not paying customers that may be implicating your ability to bring down those reps. I think there's been a lot of, similar to force majeure, we've had a lot of noise around material adverse effect, which in a non-global pandemic situation is usually reserved for the most extreme situations. Well, now we're in a most extreme situation, and admittedly, while there has been a lot of law firms publishing things about this, we're not really seeing lenders block revolver draws or take other actions, on the basis of what's happening in, due to COVID-19 being a material adverse effect. We've seen some new agreements that are carving COVID out of your material adverse effect definition, but typically speaking, it's not been a consideration that's other than lawyers wanting to talk about it, I guess. So I think
it's definitely true. There's so many conversations about material adverse effect, and with good reason, because because theoretically, well, and in reality, I mean, lenders have, in certain situations in the past, blocked borrowers from borrowing if they believe there is a material adverse effect on the business, right? So it's definitely something you want to consider. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had in the past month and a half where we've gone, where I've sat with a treasurer or a CFO and gone line by line through their material adverse effect definition in a way that they've never done before to help them understand, what they can say and what they can't say. Sorry, Ann, I interrupted.
Oh, no, I mean, it's definitely an important consideration, but I think so far, I think generally speaking, we're not seeing lenders block borrowings on that basis.
I think that's right. One more point, Ann, sorry.
Yeah.
And that is similar to what Mara talked about earlier in the real estate context. The lenders have all been encouraged by the regulators to work with borrowers who were not in distressed situations heading into the COVID-19 times. So, and as Ann has said a couple of times, our experiences, they are definitely doing that.
And I think that there was a lot of noise when everything initially came, when the lockdown started in March. There was a lot of noise primarily from some larger PE funds about making preemptive draws on your revolvers. And I think that was something that lenders faced left and right. We got a lot of questions about it. And I think that, again, we would encourage you to talk with your lender and determine if you really need to be making a draw for something more than your, immediate cash needs. And also whether or not it makes sense, right? Just from the standpoint of under your facility and keeping in mind, availability of stimulus and different things like that. So I think something to consider, but, we again would encourage you to talk with your lenders there. And then I think Carl and I wanted to briefly talk about some of the covenant issues that are being thought of or considered as it relates to COVID. I think generally speaking right now, I know as Gus mentioned, there were obviously companies that were struggling before COVID-19. So those companies and those industries, and perhaps some of the more harder hit industries may have felt these effects already in Q1. I think generally speaking though, the lenders and borrowers are bracing for impact in Q2. So I think that that's really right now is the time people are really feeling the financial impacts, and now is the time to be considering whether or not you're going to breach any of your financial covenants, and again, talking with your lenders, talking with your legal counsel, and trying to figure that out. I think, we've already heard a lot from a lot of our own clients about, and our lender and borrower clients about waivers and working through and amendments to work through those covenant issues. Again, I think typically we're seeing that for the most part, everyone's trying to neutralize the impact of COVID.
There's some very interesting amendments. There are some very interesting and very differing approaches in the market in terms of how you deal with that. Because the concern, of course, is that with revenues drying up and with no end in sight, really, not yet anyway. Nobody knows exactly how long it's going to last and how quickly things are going to come back. It's very difficult to project. So when you go to your lenders, Mara made the comment earlier that when you go to your landlord, you want to have a firm idea of what you're looking for. It's actually very difficult to project what your business is going to look like in 3, 6, 9 months, really. And so one of the astonishing things, really, in a sense, but it makes perfect sense when you think about it, that we're seeing is amendments to credit facilities that effectively ignore the earnings impact of COVID in 2019. I'm sorry, in 2020. So they'll basically say for the entire 2020, we're going to take for each of those 4 quarters, starting actually with second quarter of 2020, we're going to put a plug number of EBITDA in there that's based on historical EBITDA, because we know that any EBITDA that we put in there, any EBITDA that actually happens is not going to be meaningful in the context of how we've negotiated this entire deal. So it's now, by the way, that's not free, right? To get that, you have to be basically in an industry that's really hard hit, for example, the hotel industry, and your EBITDA and either fixed charge or leverage covenant will be replaced with a liquidity covenant, because cash is all that really people are really focused on right now, and you'll give up other rights as well. You'll give up the right to make distributions and dividends. or severely constrain those rights. You'll give up the ability to do acquisitions without lender consent. So that's one type of amendment we're seeing. We're seeing amendments really across the board from that going to more lenient amendments where where borrowers are just seeking to maybe increase their maximum permitted leverage ratio for the next few quarters. So it's fascinating to see the different things that are happening, and there's a lot of discussion, and they will continue to. I think that's only going to accelerate as we head into the period, as Ann said, where the stress gets more and more acute and visible. Let's see, Ann, do you want to talk a little bit about EBITDA generally?
Sure. So, I mean, as Carl mentioned, I think right now lenders are really more focused on liquidity is what, we're hearing and seeing. But, EBITDA, the whole point of it is to try to capture, take out the noise and figure out what is actually the earnings of the company. There's been a very popular meme floating around the finance community that is a mug that says EBITDAC, which is earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, amortization, and COVID. So obviously it's sort of funny, but not, right? I mean, COVID has impacted earnings. And again, as Carl was mentioning, how are lenders handling this? So, I mean, I think there's a couple ways, as Carl mentioned, deeming it, and then also, just again, trying to neutralize it. But I think that it really is, the lenders are more focused now on liquidity because EBITDA as it is somewhat of a, fiction to some extent that you're trying to get really to the root and have, various add backs. But, I think that everyone's recognizing that borrowers are trying to somehow capture the impact of COVID, and a lot of times looking to add back that lost revenue. And again, I think that there's a couple ways to handle that. But again, companies are just everyone is sort of the common goal of trying to neutralize this, and really focus on the main, which is liquidity.
I think that's right. You do have some very interesting discussions about the extent to which COVID-related losses and charges might fit within the extraordinary items add back of a typical EBITDA definition, for example. It'll be interesting to see, and by the way, and we've seen some amendments to credit facilities that specifically block the ability to add anything back to those extraordinary items there. And we've seen others that don't do that. So a lot of interesting conversations and discussions around that, things that you should be discussing with your advisors as well. But I concur with Ann that generally people are trying to work through this and to put together productive amendments that allow the company to move forward and try and work through this. Gus, in the remaining time, we've got 6 minutes left here, it appears, and we probably want to, I don't know if we have questions that are rolling in, but we might want to leave a little bit of time for a question and answer if there are any. But Gus, do you want to wrap up with some thoughts on operating in the vicinity of insolvency?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Carl. So, one of the things that we've kind of talked, and I've tried to kind of pepper some of the insolvency stuff throughout the presentation, because there are hints and bits and pieces that become relevant all along the way. When you're actually, you're not just dealing with an entity that has this isolated, issue that they're trying to address, but you've got a larger issue. Actually, at one point, I want to make, not necessarily from the company side as to its own distress, but when you're dealing with someone that's insolvent, is I think that it's also important to be aware, especially if you're a seller of goods and you discover that your buyer is insolvent or files for bankruptcy. There are specific remedies that you have that put you in a better position. One of the things that we talked about when we were talking about how do you pick and choose what you do and how do you deal with your counterparties, another point that, that's worth keeping in mind is, is something about to occur where you're going to be worse off than had you acted. So the one example that we're litigating in a retail case right now, where we represent a foreign vendor, is the vendor discovers the company's insolvent or its bankruptcy is imminent. Should they, one of the rights the UCC gives you is the right, and not only that, the CISG, the International Law on Sale of Goods, allows you to stop goods in transit. And that the right to stop goods in transit is enforceable both before bankruptcy, even after a bankruptcy, and it's not considered a violation of the automatic stay. So it's a very powerful right to make sure that you're going to get paid for those goods and that you actually have an administrative expense with respect to them. But with respect to a company, again, we're talking about these isolated incidents now. It's possible that at some point they begin to aggregate and you actually are insolvent. Insolvency can occur via balance sheet, where your debts and liabilities exceed the value of your assets, or it could, when you have the general inability to pay your debts as they become due. In any of those cases where you're insolvent, it's worthwhile stepping back and kind of assessing the situation and being proactive about how you're going to address that and how you move forward. And part of the reason is not that, officers and directors get sued every time someone gets insolvent, but there are things that you can do to potentially minimize the risk of getting sued, or also potentially put you in a better position to defend that. And the reason insolvency is relevant for officers and directors, especially if you look at some of the bankruptcy courts decisions that have come out on this, is that it's not that your fiduciary duties change. You continue to have a duty of care and a duty of loyalty. But one of the things that the courts have focused on and looked at is, well, when boards are making decisions or officers are making decisions about the transactions they're about to enter into, are they more likely to bet the ranch and try to generate some return for equity holders versus taking steps that preserve and maximize value? And so it's it's like, do you take everything you have and go to a casino and bet on black because that's the only way that you can return something to your equity holders? Or do you take the safer approach and you manage it, your expenses and really potentially, generate only a recovery for your creditors? And so one of the things that I always recommend when I'm talking to my corporate colleagues and others is like, look, if you're getting close to this, it's always worthwhile to have a fiduciary duty presentation, to bring in an advisor to review your fiduciary duties and the impact of insolvency on those. And again, part of the reason to do this is it provides cover to the board and the directors and officers in that, it shows that they are diligent in understanding what their fiduciary duties are. It shows that they want to be educated and consider all things, and that they're making their decisions with a view towards those fiduciary duties. And as I indicated, the current trend of the law is that your fiduciary duties don't change. It's still the duty of care, duty of loyalty, but and you continue to have fiduciary duties to the company and to the shareholders. But there was a time where there was some dispute as to whether or not maybe there was a shifting and you actually owed duties to creditors. Most of the case law now has turned around or has settled on the fact that you generally don't owe direct duties to creditors. So creditors can't sue you in their individual capacity for a breach. But your duties always remain to the corporation or to the entity. The basic counsel is that, you should act in a manner that preserves and maximizes the value of the company. And so it's good when you're in the vicinity of insolvency or insolvent to recognize and to assume that the transactions that you enter into, you may lose the benefit of the business judgment rule, and you may have to prove the entire fairness of the transaction, that it's both the process was fair and the price was fair. But all along the way, I guess the one thing that I would say to, you know, as you enter that, you know, I think one of the things that's most critical is to assemble a team, a structuring team of business folks and professional advisors that are going to help you figure out how to address these issues on a corporate basis or on a collective basis. You have to decide whether or not your current management has the skills necessary to do it. Your lenders are going to question whether or not you have those skills. And so putting together a team that's credible, that can kind of help you navigate and determine what your different options are, is critical. And so, you know, one of the things, you know, that I'll kind of wrap up with is that, you know, we always say in the restructuring world, it's like your business could be like a melting ice cube, right? And value is deteriorating as that ice cube melts away. And so finding the right people to kind of keep that ice cube, as much of that ice cube in place for as long as possible, is going to give you your best options. And so I would not hesitate to I would be proactive in bringing people in to at least start thinking about what your alternatives are. Hopefully you never need them, that taking the steps that we've talked about to potentially buy time is enough. But if you need more, the sooner you begin to consider your different options, the more options you'll have. And I think that's what's the most critical part of whenever you're going into this, you know, contingency planning, restructuring, bankruptcy potential scenario, is to kind of understand what your options are and preserve them as best as you can.
Thanks, Gus. And I guess I'll close it off just by echoing what you said, that really for all of the things that we've been talking about here today, I think getting out in front of it and having conversations early and trying to develop strategies now, and then contacting counterparties and working with them early in a careful but smart manner is probably the biggest thing that I take away from this panel. Really, is that really there are things you can do now, decisions that you can make, and advice that you can get that can make a big difference in how you're able to weather the storm. Not just from your lawyers, but from your accountants and from other finance professionals and from all the stakeholders in your business. So it's a very difficult time to operate a business, for sure. And I'm hopeful that some of the things we've talked about here today will be helpful to some of you in making progress with that. Thank you for your time and attention. We don't have any Q&A that I see. We're happy to hang around here for a minute or two if people are typing some in. And Maggie, are you there?
Yes.
We can open up the lines for questions too if people want it for 5 or 10 minutes. Maggie, how would they let you know if they wanted to ask a question?
They would raise their hand.
Ah, okay. All right, we'll give it 30 seconds here to see if any hands get raised. Or maybe 15 seconds. Okay, seeing none, I think we're going to call it. Thank you so much.